Assalamu alaikum. My name is John Janney. I'm the Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations, Dallas-Fort Worth Chapter, or CAIR DFW. Today we are launching a Coffee with CAIR podcast, which is a podcast that we want to have as an event recorded before a live studio audience. And today we have with us Dr. Mike Irashiki, Professor of Sociology at Hill College, correct? And he's going to talk to us about the myth of race. So before we get into it, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you interested in this topic of race.
Well, thanks for having me here today. Sociology is a interesting, multifaceted subject that's always fascinated me, and I think everyone is a armchair sociologist. And race falls under one of those things that, why do people act this way? That's what sociologists ask. So my seeing race and my also being a minority put me in situations where I would experience racism and seeing racism towards other people. So that's, I think, a good research area.
So let's just dive right into it. I mean, what is race and why is it a myth?
This area is really about knowing how people use words and knowing who uses it how. I call race a myth because it leads people to believe that certain groups of people are geographically origined. They came from separate geographical places, and they are like separate types of humans, in effect. And two, that these different groups have different capabilities. That's the misleading part of it. That's the myth of it. Now, if you look around, you can see different colored people, and you can say those are different races. However, people impute more meaning into it than just color. Even between white people, there are different statuses of groups. So what is race? I call it a myth, a way people use that word in maybe a faulty way.
So what you're saying is that even though there are differences of appearances based on where an individual's ancestry comes from, then that doesn't constitute enough difference to consider people different enough to classify them, or?
Well, let's go back to how the consensus of scientists view people, like how different colored peoples came from. The consensus is that humans originated in Africa. They migrated globally. The same DNA, same species is everywhere in the world. Now, the difference in color comes from the adaptation to the environment. And there's all kinds of mutation going on with each generation. Those that were, say, slightly lighter may have an advantage, say, in certain parts of the globe. Those that were darker may have more skin protection against sunlight. So the same species exists globally, the same DNA basically, but evolution is quick to weed out those that are not the optimal, not only color, but body, superficial parts of your body. So skin color will make a difference based on where you are in the equator. If you're close to the equator, you want some protection against sunlight. And if you're up north or very far south, you want to absorb vitamin D also. So that's a theory that those that are not getting enough vitamin D are at a disadvantage. And I heard this one scientist told me that some blacks that are afraid to go out into the sun to become even darker because of the stigma of darkness, actually have vitamin D deficiencies. So back to the explanation of different colors, that's basically the only difference, is that skin color and other superficial features helped adaptation to the environment.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, skin tone, just like hair color and eye color, all superficial. But at some point in history, someone made it a point to say that these differences classified something greater than they actually do.
Yeah, definitely. If you go from extreme north to extreme south or near the equator, you will see a big difference in appearance and in culture. In reality, it's really a gradient of skin lightness and darkness. You know, you take someone from Norway, you take someone from Sudan, there's a big difference in color. But if you walk from Sudan to Norway, can you do that? No?
Let's pretend.
You will imperceptibly, won't even notice the difference in skin colors as you walk from Sudan to Norway. It's a very slow gradation in color. Now, when explorers first came from, say, the north to the southern or equator areas, they saw not only a difference in skin color, but culture. Are these really humans? Are they different species? Which is a reasonable, hypothesis. Could there be different human species? So they also saw that their culture was, quote, undeveloped, and would impute these qualities to the humans they saw down there. So that was kind of the first formation of this concept of race, that, okay, they are different skin color, they are different culture, they may be underdeveloped, and maybe mistakenly impute that to their capabilities, biological capabilities.
So do they kind of feel a need to classify them kind of like how we classify Homo sapiens and Neanderthals? I mean, was it that drastic of a difference?
Yeah. It was a big question.
Right.
And also the science of classification was starting around that time with Darwin and species, Spencer, that it's a hypothesis. There could be different species. They didn't have a good understanding, maybe, but the idea was there.
But we know now that we're all Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
It seems like elements from these, early assumptions kind of linger. And I would imagine that this has impacts that kind of ripple throughout society. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, especially when different colored people are assigned different statuses in society, especially, say, the taking of slaves, darker-skinned humans as slaves, and then that group is constantly being seen in that status as a lower status, lower capabilities, less education, and that becomes this norm or expectation, of different classes of people. And I see it with myself too. People see me as Asian. They think, what's the stereotype of Asians? Smart, or they drive bad, or
do my math homework, I guess.
Yeah, play violent. I do play violent, but it's not biological. It's cultural. But sometimes those expectations make it come true. So if a population expects a certain minority group to be inferior, they may withhold resources from them, and education and jobs and all that, and that group will become inferior in terms of wealth and education and so forth. So it's this, like
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy,
right.
yeah. in science it's called the Thomas theorem.
Right, okay. Well, I guess that leads us to what is racism, because it seems that racist structures is kind of what you're touching on here.
Yeah, racism or being racist means a target group is actions of one group create this detriment of another group. So say racist jokes. Does that really hurt people? Yeah, because it reinforces stereotypes. So a racist joke will contribute to the detriment of that target group. Now, sometimes I discuss with my classes, what about white jokes? Is that detrimental to whites? Well, if anyone knows anyone know white jokes here? One is, what does a white housewife make for dinner? Reservations. Is that detrimental towards the white group? It's actually detrimental towards non-whites because it implies whites have this privilege to make reservations. So I forgot where we were
Well,
going
we're talking
for
about
there.
racism, but I think what you're touching on is that there's a power dynamic that comes into play in terms of racism, right? Like, it's one thing to say that one race talks poorly about another, but then there's an issue of, well, can those actions or words affect any detriment? Like, if it's, like with us, the white joke, it doesn't hurt me at all. That's because, white male people are typically in a privileged status in our society currently.
Yeah, well, it's actions and attitudes that will, contribute to this. Now, on an extreme side, it's, say slavery and forced physical violence will create a detriment to that target group. And one thing about the target group is that everyone is a potential victim. So when you pick out a quality such as skin color or race, everyone in that group is a potential victim when you're using that as the criterion. Now, does it work in reverse? Can whites be, can another group be racist against whites? Well, I suppose, but it all depends on power, and does it cause a detriment to the group as a whole?
Well, at that point, then the dynamics would have to completely change with it.
Yeah, and this could be possible in different societies where, it's not white, it's maybe something else. And also, this is not limited to skin color. People will use culture, nationality, religion in, quote, racist ways, that they use it in the same way. They take that attribute and apply it to the whole group and somehow disadvantage that group.
You brought up something earlier, I guess the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect, or the Thompson theorem, I think. Right?
Thomas
theorem. And I got a sense that there's a lot of elements that's personal, like there are interpersonal racism, but there are institutional racism that I guess comes to play at some point. What about that?
Yeah, well, personal racism is one person being, racist to another person, but in a society that this has been going on throughout the whole society, it becomes embedded in the whole society, in its laws, norms, culture, things that really create disadvantage to these target groups. So institutional racism, we might know some examples as Jim Crow laws, or you couldn't marry other races here, or redlining, things like that. Things that are embedded not only in laws, but in norms, in jokes, in the way we do life, since it's been very highly advantaged towards the dominant majority.
And I guess in our current times, things like gerrymandering, or a lot of the voter ID or different laws to try to disenfranchise minority groups.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one excuse would be, oh, it's not racist, it's more about money, say. But it becomes racist because different racial groups will have different levels of wealth and income. So the excuse that, oh, it's not race, it's money, is almost the same reasoning.
So it's socioeconomic and racism just kind of mixed.
Yeah.
In the motivation, right. Now you touched on something about culture earlier, and that kind of begs the question of how is race different than ethnicity?
Ethnicity is, you can call it a culture. Well, there's different definitions. Like the US Census calls ethnicity either Hispanic or not Hispanic. Other definitions are some belonging to a certain culture or nationality. Or you can define it as maybe differences between, quote, Asians, of Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Those are different ethnicities of the Asian groups. So ethnicity can be used also in a racist way. But that also raises the question, the way the US Census uses it. They say Hispanics can be of any race, which means there were no Hispanics, say, 600 years ago. It's been created by the Spanish colonialism, and where they mated and created cultures around the world with different, quote, races, created these ethnicities, Hispanic ethnicities. So you can say ethnicity is more of a cultural belonging.
So, but you mentioned before that, and how we had talked about it earlier, is that race as a biological, I guess, classification is a myth has been busted, essentially.
Yes.
But
yes.
that just kind of drags on. But do you think that race, outside of a biological, I guess, classification mode or consideration, is a legitimate way of talking, or do you think that it's just causes more problems than it solves?
Well, we have to be careful about, there are some genetic patterns that say, like sickle cell anemia, or certain people have certain health tendencies, but those have been mainly propagated through starting it from a mutation to a whole family line. It's not really a racial classification. I also want to mention each, say, race, I use race always with quotes now, has more variation within a group than between groups. Say within what we would call white groups, there is more variation within that white group than between a white group and a non-white group.
So you're saying we don't all look alike?
Yes, I'm learning that. Let me bring up this term white also. We need to maybe learn how people use the term white. And that's not just skin color, because many white-colored people have not been considered white. They've been using this term white more as either WASP or a dominant majority or a certain group that has certain cultural values, and norms. And there are some books I've written, like how the Jews became white. That's not a skin color thing, but it means that they've been incorporated into the dominant majority, or how the Italians became white. I just heard this anecdote, this incident that a friend of mine, Noor Sadeh, told me that she's a convert. She's a white convert, and I hope she doesn't mind me talking about her. Is she here? Someone, a group of people, I think, commented that she wasn't white, or all the whites except her. She was like the exception. That's maybe becoming non-white, in a sense, from white to non-white. So we have to understand how people use this term, white.
Interesting. So what can people do, I guess? I mean, for example, I hear a lot of times to say, we need to go beyond race. I mean, there's the whole idea of colorblindness, which I think is I think most people kind of see as a bit misguided because for various reasons. I'm sure you could touch on it better than I can. But then other people say we need to go beyond race because we're all part of a human race. And I think I've heard people kind of criticize that as well. Could you touch on that issue of, when people say they're colorblind versus, people want to go to the human race? Is there a human race?
Well, if we use the term race, we're implying there's categories within, it's one category of something else. So we would use human race if we're talking about non-humans also, to imply those categories. But this term colorblindness, it means that personally, one doesn't see color. They are not discriminatory. And that's a good start. But since there is institutional racism around, that still is a discriminatory force in society. So to get rid of racism, one would need to not only be colorblind, but to seek out institutional racism, find these norms and rules and redlining and these Jim Crow laws and these norms that are discriminatory, and get rid of them. There is one also problem with colorblindness, that you're not seeing people with their background, their culture. One can also embrace difference, embrace their cultures, which colorblindness would ignore.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Because if you're thinking colorblindness and someone who comes to me who's different, and I refuse to see that difference, and I guess by default I'm assuming they're just like me, which I find very problematic.
Yeah, and that's also creating an expectation that the dominant majority would, is the correct, culture.
Everyone has to assimilate on, the dominant majority's, I guess, values.
Right. So I guess using big words, instead of assimilation, the term would be pluralism, is to allow and embrace different cultures.
Which would be the opposite of colorblindness.
Right.
Color awareness and acceptance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And you were also mentioning, is there what can we do about this? Is there, any solutions? It's hard for culture to change norms. I tell my students, people have to die, meaning it takes the next generation maybe to change. So if we incorporate education like we just had on race into schools, how different colors were formed, how race was, the concept of race was developed and exploited, maybe the next generations would think differently about it.
So it's basically going to be a process of evolution, social evolution.
Yeah,
But we have to be determinate. We have to affect it.
It's taken about 500 years to get to this point, so it might take a little longer to reverse that.
Right. Well, hopefully it'll progress a little faster as we move on. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn it over for Q&A. So we can start over here.
Yeah, I have a few questions if it's a lull, but I've heard distinctions drawn between terms like racism, racial discrimination, obviously, and prejudice. And, one definition of racism, is based on some form of systematic component, and, less so in individual activity. How do you view those kinds of distinctions, and what's your take on that?
We have to know how people use those terms, what they mean when they use those terms. We can't get into semantic differences like, oh, but racism means this. No, we need to understand what do they mean by it. Basic difference between prejudice and discrimination is prejudice is more of an attitude of thought, and discrimination is the action. So there's one difference there. And the term, when you use the term race, anything with the term race is subject to some arguments because of the problem with the word race. But I would just say, what does the person mean when they bring up those terms?
Next. Yes.
I'm just going to toss this out, that just as race is a misnomer when trying to describe differences in physical appearance, I would suggest the term breed, as is used in reference to dogs, would also be a similar misnomer, because as humans are of the same species, Homo sapiens, dogs are of the same species, the canines, despite their differences of opinion. Their differences of appearance. And so what I'm suggesting is that words are used in a very discriminatory or prejudicial way to describe humans. Using having a breed is just an example, which has also been used to in a derogatory sense toward humans.
Yeah, that's right. And it also kind of raises this subject of eugenics. And, it's probably possible to artificially breed very extreme forms of Homo sapiens, just like with dogs. That's why there's so much, backlash against experimentation, with humans. But you're right, the term breed, we need to understand how the person is using it. What do they mean by that?
It's interesting because there's backlash even in the breeding world in terms of the dogs, saying every breed is equal. There's a lot of big pushback nowadays about that. I just kind of find it interesting.
Mm-hmm. One interesting thing you can do to see the society's viewpoint on words is to do a Google image search on certain words, like Google white, Google black, Google beautiful woman, Google the difference between like African American and black. You'll see different pictures of those words. And that's a kind of a hint at how society considers these words.
Because the search engines would aggregate how people classify or
yeah, what's found on websites
right.
worldwide. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. I have been here in this country for about 40, 50 years, and I have seen racism, ethnicity in different forms from 60s to 2018. It is not just black and white, because in 50s, I think, Jews who were all white Europeans, they were discriminated just like that.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
So here, it is not race, it becoming religious ethnicity. When first wave of Indians come, like in 60s, 70s, they were not discriminated because they were highly educated, engineers, doctors, they were all well respected. And although they have different color, different tone, different pronunciation, but they have been accepted. And at that time, before that, I know Japanese have been discriminated very well. So in this country has a very interesting history of discrimination. Somehow, I don't know, although this is a great country to live in because it accepted people from all over the world, and everybody had given equal opportunity to actualize their dream. But everybody has been discriminated. Polish people have been discriminated. Irish have been discriminated, just like you said, there were Polish jokes, Irish jokes, and they were discriminated. And then when I come here, the first thing I become very aware is the black and white discrimination. And I'll just take a minute to give you one interesting story. I came to St. Louis, then I moved to New York, to Albert Einstein College of Medicine, college, and I was the only Muslim there for a long time. And then I had a responsibility for mental health care for the area, and I was the director, and I had about 200 employees. And before I joined as a director, there was a lot of tension. So in the first meeting, there were about 200 employees came, and there were about 40% African American, 30% or Hispanic, and 20-30% white. And African Americans make a noise that here in this center they have been discriminated. So what I did in the first meeting, I said I was born in India, and I was never become aware of black and white. I was colorblind, just like you mentioned, because one of my uncle is as white as Anglo-Saxon, another uncle is as dark as Sudanese, and the rest of them have different shades. So, and they were all my close relatives, cousins and uncles and aunts. So I said, I grew up where I don't know what black and white means. And believe me, I served there for 4 or 5 years, and I never heard the complaint about discrimination by the executive director. So I think it's the mental, it's the mindset. People were born here with the mindset of looking down anybody who is not Anglo-Saxon somehow. And until that is changed, it will be hard. But I have seen there were periods where there was much less racial tension, and now there is a period in which the racial tension has gone sky high. And obviously, I don't have to tell the reasons. You all know the reasons of that. That's why we are trying to see what is the solution. And I think you mentioned about education, but then you said we have to wait the whole generation. So is there anything we do in this generation to reduce the tension? What I do is I go and meet people, I say, look, my color is different, my pronunciation is different, but I'm not different than you are.
Right.
Is there any other suggestion you have?
I haven't seen any good solutions in the literature. So that's, I think if there was a solution, it would be happening now. Yes?
But there's different levels though, right? I mean, there's the interpersonal level, right, where we could, I guess, find solutions in our own personal lives. But I know what you work on primarily is in larger, like social scale, correct? And that's where it gets, I guess, a bit more difficult.
For those that want to improve themselves, personally, those that read a lot will learn that, oh, this wasn't true that I, grew up with. So there is this personal exploration that we can do individually. But that's for those that want to learn, want to improve.
Yeah, I mean, and I was going to bring that up to my, what happens with whites a lot. I mean, you have obviously, Caucasians who are consciously racist and all of that, and like it. You have others who, struggle with it. They recognize that they have racist views, but they want to change. And then there are a lot of people like, you mentioned education stuff. That's not enough to do it. I mean, what I found about myself, but I'm still discovering it in myself. And I've been working at reading and stuff like this. You know, I'm 63, and I lived the vast majority of my life in a pure white, upper class suburb, upper middle class suburb. Right? I thought that I wasn't racist. I mean, I political liberal, having been through the Jim Crow era, and been involved in the civil rights movement, right? I thought I was done with all that. Well, discovered I'm way far from it. If you're a white guy and you live in a predominantly white area, your friends are predominantly white, you go to restaurants that are white, you consume TV that defines you as white, things like that. You walk around with all of these views that are socialized.
Yeah, you're innocently racist.
Yeah. And it's very hard.
I like that term.
It's very hard.
It lets a lot of people off the hook.
And that's also called white privilege. That
But when I really noticed it, and frankly, I think Donald Trump for this. When he was elected, I first really broke out, with the Muslim ban. And that's when I started volunteering for CAIR.
Mhm.
And then I became very active in DACA and, police brutality and things like that. But I also moved out of the suburbs, right? And I live I've lived in 2 different areas in the last 5 years, both of them very diverse, ethnically, racially, and religiously, right? And that's helped me learn a lot about myself. But how do most white guys aren't going to do that, right? And that to me is where the biggest part of the problem is the separation of the race, the de facto separation of the races that still exist.
Mhm. Yeah, that's part of white privilege. The dominant majority doesn't need to know the other's stories. I had this thought, I've just forgot what it was, but you try to acknowledge white privilege and not be ashamed of it, but to know that you are in a certain world that maybe others are not in, and maybe go actively search for education or difference or knowledge, about that. So.
He brought up something that I find interesting, and that is the media that I guess trains society.
Mhm.
And what I've noticed lately is that media is beginning to incorporate a lot of diversity, but not just like racial diversity, but religious diversity. I'm seeing a lot more hijabs on different advertisements for things like Coke or Nike or even libraries, where they'll say, come read, and where it would normally be in the past, it was all white children, then it started getting more diverse, and then now we're seeing even more. What impact do you think that these movements?
Oh,
have on society?
definitely a movement for diversity. I'm a little suspicious about some of these initiatives that, say, and it goes with racism too. Some people are granted prestige by their peers to be racist, part of the group, so it keeps the circle going. Companies with these initiatives may do it because of prestige from the community. Because corporations are machines, they go by what maximizes stockholder wealth. So that's all they're focused on. So they are going to see, what do stockholders want? How do they maximize the wealth of the stockholders? And maybe it's by they see the community wanting to see more diversity. So that's how that would happen. So, maybe there is this force out there that is causing these corporations to do these initiatives.
But wouldn't you find that pressure on, because I see what you're saying, like there's monetary motivation, but pressure has to come to make it monetary motivation, right? So the pressure has to be social to impact the monetary motivation.
And fortunately there is pressure growing, so it's coming from somewhere. maybe the foundation of the United States is still there as far as this Declaration of Diversity and equality, that we still want it somehow, even though we may not do it all the time. So I'm not sure where that force is really coming from. I think there's enough diversity in even the dominant majority, liberal, conservative diversity, to have these different voices.
I think we should go back to the question about the white jokes affecting, hurting white people. Even though I know there are a lot of people in your category that are upper class white people who do have white privilege, there are a huge number, many more white people who are really poor. And there are many more people like me who are not white, but who are considered white by society. I was not taught that I was white. I am an Indian, American Indian, raised in Indian country, and I was raised in Indian culture, and I do not feel like a white person, and I don't identify with white people, and I have been discriminated against because I'm considered white. I mean, I honestly have been discriminated against because I'm considered white, not just by my own people, by people who don't even know me. I teach in Afghanistan for free. I'm a certified, highly qualified teacher. I teach full-time in Afghanistan for free because they need teachers on the internet. I have two students, one student who'd known me for a month asked me for $10,000. Another one who had known me for about 4 months asked me for $1,000. They think because my skin is white that I am rich. I'm not in that category. I'm a Native American Indian. We were slaughtered. And, in this conversation, there's been talk about black people being mistreated. Black people were treated like slaves. Black people were not slaughtered by millions. We were slaughtered by the millions. And black people were treated terrible. And there's a very close connection between a lot of black people and Native Americans because of the affinity they feel. But still, and I've been taught by my many years of work in civil rights, I have been taught to be empathetic for white people who do not fit in your category. It doesn't come natural for me, but I've been learning it over the years because a lot of them really struggle, and a lot of them are not prejudiced, and they're just trying to survive and deal with all of the problems that exist in this world of ours that we're surviving right now.
And I'm undeniably white and privileged, no question about it. And the reason I brought that up from the, like the economic status thing is that, people talk about, education is the fix-all, and people with more money, were more educated, so they got it. But, maybe there's, education helps dispel some of the more conscious parts of racism. It does nothing, really, to dispel the more subtle forms.
Yeah, and it depends on the education too. We're getting the dominant majority education. But you raised some good points, and these remind me of things like passing, that non-whites who look white will gain some advantage in society. There is what's called intersection of either race, gender, ethnicity, social class, that are valid, hierarchies, I shouldn't say valid hierarchies, but they're different categories that will, impact each other. Because, all whites aren't privileged. There's social class differences, there's all kinds of differences. And also there are, we talk maybe a lot about white and black, but a lot of the quote races and ethnicities in between still get hit. It seems like blacks get hit the hardest, but you raise a point that the Native Americans really got hit hard, and they are almost left out of the conversation. So these are good points that need to be talked about. Yes? Yes?
My question is, do you think that America, do we lead the ideology of what race is? Are we the ones who kind of set the standard for the rest of the world of what racism looks like in America's opinion?
There's different types of racism, say in a country like Brazil, maybe India. There's colorism, there's different shades. And it also seems to be that the lighter you are, the more privilege you would get. So we won't have the argument of necessarily black and white in other countries, but there may be colorism issues, tribal issues. If everyone is of the same skin color, there still may be differences of religion, ethnicities, social class.
We have the strongest media, and we have the biggest bark versus Europe or Asia. And I kind of feel, in my opinion, that we kind of set the standard for the rest of the world of how we see racism, and everybody just kind of tags along with that ideology. I have no stats for that. That's that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I don't know. It may apply or not apply as much to different countries. Say in Japan, there is a colorism there. The lighter you are, the better. There is a high prejudice and discrimination against non-Japanese there. And I don't know if they are learning any lessons, from us. Of course, scholars will analyze different, literature from various places, but, you raise a good point. You had a question.
You had a question here? I think she had her.
I was just going to comment on going way back, the advertising, that it's great that increasing public awareness is increasing with different groups, LGBT or cultural, whatever. But that it's kind of unfortunate that it's being done, for instance, on television through being used as a marketing tool. That ideally there should be a way of raising consciousness without resorting to marketing. So.
Yeah.
You had a question, ma'am?
From what I've learned over the years, because I've been concerned with racism a lot of times, educators saying that the only way we're ever going to solve this problem is to talk about it, to talk about it very deeply and very honestly, and how painful that is. And I've had some experiences with that. And it is extremely painful, really painful. And I've had the privilege to know a lot of African American people, Hispanic people, and one friend I had for years. We had many experiences together, breakfast every week for years, and discussed racism. And one day she said to me, I have to tell you that even though I know who you are, I know that, you're really not racist, but there's a barrier that comes up when I'm with you. And it comes from how my family was treated. My father was called boy, all the time, and all those kind of things. She says it's not you as such, it's just because of the white race. And that's just difficult to get over, even though she and I love each other. So those kinds of issues, there's so many layers of racism. Layer after layer after layer. So sometimes even if you try, if you overlook colors, if you just want to see that person as a person, which is beautiful and exploratory and helpful, there's still sometimes that distrust that goes back so many layers back that you have to work at it. You have to really work at it. But I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind is to talk about it, even though it's painful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had a question.
A couple of comments. I agree completely with what you said. And I think maybe where the real issue begins is if we're willing, like the gentleman said,
to put it in our own face and think about it. I don't think it's at all helpful. I think it's distracting and taking us down the wrong path to conflate white privilege and socioeconomic standing. It's not just people who have money and are white that have privilege. They may not feel it, but they have privileges in ways, like you said, that there's not enough separation between them and the conferring of privilege automatically by our culture, where they can even get airspace to look at it and say, oh my God, in all other ways. It's not just the bank account and the bespoke suit who experiences that. I think also it's very treacherous to get into comparative suffering of groups because each group that has suffered has been dealt more harsh and in many cases fatal hands by a group in power. That group in power had privilege. In the case of people I have known from Asia area, the people in power in the communities who were lighter skinned were able to make horrible inroads into the lives of the other people in the village, in the city, who had darker skins, and they were from the same group. And this was a powerful lesson to me. As women, we've been attacked, assaulted, cut, raped, murdered, you name it. And I'm not getting into, I don't consider myself a victim. I don't know that anybody else in this room does. But that's another group. And so don't tell me about suffering. I know about suffering. I have had many discussions with African Americans who were not at all sympathetic to the situation of your farm workers, or certainly now in many cases, the people who are fleeing hell in Central America because they were not ripped out of their country and brought here on ships. Everybody is suffering. And if somebody comes at you assuming that you are something that you're not, and something that is of a higher status, which may be white, instead of, it's easy at first, I think, to take it in the face. It's like you feel like you've been slapped. But use it. It's a teachable moment for you, for each one of us, where we realize it may not apply to me. You know who you are, and you know it doesn't apply to you. But you see how it works, and you see how other people believe it to the point that you appear to be white, you are an American, you appear to be better off than they are, i.e. wealthy. And so to hear that, it's not such a strange thing to hear, but I can only imagine how it struck you. Well, you explained that very well.
Yeah, can I, speaking about white, I see Sister Noor is out here. And we talked about your incident, but can you kind of just quickly explain it in a way I couldn't explain it before?
My friend and I we're both American converts to Islam of many years. We're both in the Midwest. I'm from Wisconsin, she's from the Chicago area. And we were chatting maybe loudly yesterday in a cafe, and a woman came over to talk to us a little bit. And as we were talking, she said, well, as the only white woman in the room, meaning her, and I started to laugh, and I'm like, skin tone, actually, we have 2 shades lighter than you are, you're very tan. And because we were wearing a scarf, she could not comprehend that we were white women because of our scarves. And we're both much more lily white, if you want, skin tone, than this woman. And I could see in her face, like, even when I said that, well, we're white, she's like, well, you're not. You're not anymore. You left your whiteness and you put that scarf on your head. And we've just been talking about this all day. And it's just like, first time I've run into something like that, like I lost my whiteness when I became a Muslim. Like, okay, fine. Because you can't be Muslim and white. You need to be African American, you need to be Indian, you need to be
the next book will be how.
Person of color, you can't be.
Yeah, the next book will be how the Muslims
became
white. So that shows how it's more than just skin color that goes into this word white.
So as we're getting a little bit low on time, we'll have to limit our comments to questions only, but I think you had a question.
Well, I was going to ask, one of the most popular movies right now is Rich Asians, right? This new movie that's out, whatever this is, yeah. So is it really about black, white, brown? Or do we have this divide in our nation that's based on the green? And where do we go with that?
I haven't seen that movie. I'm kind of scared to, afraid to.
How stereotypical of you.
And you know, it's more than just black, white, brown. It's been many ethnicities. It happens within an ethnicity, colorism. So I'm not sure what that movie really is exploiting there.
But as John mentioned, we've got this huge fascination, media and Instagram and Snapchat, and we're looking at Kardashians, we're looking at very overinflated lifestyles. I mean, the big fat Greek wedding, my super sweet 16, where they throw huge birthday parties, very elaborate. We've got this divide in our country that is really about money and economics. And I see that as a larger problem because you could probably shed, as Noor and I experienced, we might be able to shed our color in a way, but there's always going to be the green factor. I think that this have and have not is so strong, and it's probably our next greatest challenge.
And racism has contributed to this economic divide also. You know, there have been many explicit laws that kept certain minorities off of opportunities from government benefits, welfare subsidies.
Well,
No.
look at the voting situation now. Do we have to have proof of legal residence? And I mean, we're looking at Jim Crow. I don't think we've ever left Jim Crow, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
You had a question. You had a question?
Nora, you had a
I
question?
wonder too, like, the fact that we keep talking about race relations and we keep emphasizing we're black, we're white, we're this, aren't we making the problem greater? We keep emphasizing on our ethnicity and our skin colors, and we're not talking about the people that we are. You know, we talk about white privilege, or we talk about the black situation, you know, what's going on with the police and so forth, and the brutality, and I just wonder, because we're happy to be who we are, and we're proud of, you know, Black Lives Matter and Asian Lives Matter, everybody lives matter. Are we making it worse by continuing to bring attention and education to these people, but keeping the label coming all the time?
I think it's
Like,
not.
I want you to recognize me as an African American, but I'm going to keep stressing I'm different, I'm different, I'm different, I'm different.
We should maybe view that not as necessarily the attempted solution, but as a response. When things start happening, these are the responses that come out. That's why, say, protests come out. That's why these campaigns come out. We should really look at them as reactions, responses, rather than, oh, this is a solution, and we maybe find fault in that solution. So that's...
And it's also a very complicated issue, I imagine, too. I mean, there isn't, I know there's a desire to find that, you know, we can isolate this one thing and then we can easily apply this one solution and boom, it's all fixed. But as we've discovered throughout this conversation, I mean, there's socioeconomic, there's cultural issues, there's conditioning issues, which we brought up, all play, you know, and then the history behind it, the misnomer that early on there was thoughts that, you know, these could be different, I guess genetically different people. Or I don't know if that's the right word, genetically, or species-wise, that, you know, these were different species of people, and later, of course, we realized that no, we're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before we close, since CAIR is, you know, a force behind Muslim rights, there's a similarity between what my family saw in World War II and what's happening with Muslims today. You know, my father and his family was imprisoned in these camps, and his mother, my grandmother, was put in another camp, a prison, because she taught Japanese, and she died in that. And they had the travel ban, the registry, all the same things you'll hear today. And I don't know if Muslims will be interned in prisons, but at least the Japanese got $20,000, the survivors each. So there's some benefit there.
So you say we should allow ourselves to be interned?
Yeah, you can.
I kind of like my freedom. All right. Well, that I think wraps it up. I don't think we have any more questions. I want to thank everyone for coming and participating and bringing such good questions and comments to the floor. We plan to do this monthly in different locations. I believe we're doing it in Plano next month, but I don't think we're 100% yet on that. But before you go, we are having a banquet in Arlington, not far from here, on September 21st. Who here knows who Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf is? Okay. He's an NBA superstar. He's a legend. I think it was the three-point throw, I think what he got really popular on. I mean, amazing talent. 20 years, like literally almost to the day, before Colin Kaepernick. I always want to say Kirkpatrick for some reason. Kaepernick did his anthem protest. 20 years before that, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf refused to stand, and he became essentially the first anthem protester to protest racial injustice in America. And he eventually reached a compromise where he would stand, but he would put his hands out and make dua for all oppressed people. And that was the compromise that he made. But he became essentially an example and role model for athletes 20 years later who, when the racial tensions and everything, I guess came to a head to a certain point. And so he was way ahead of his time. And September 21st, he'll be here speaking in Arlington. And it'd be great to have you all there. And I think I've met him personally. He's actually from Mississippi, where I'm from. And not just from Mississippi, he's from the Gulf Coast and the neighboring city. Like I would be from Richardson, he would be from Plano. I mean, that's how close we were from each other. And of course we met in Dallas because, Texas is great. But he's a super nice guy, just the nicest guy you'd ever meet, very humble. So we hope to have all of you here on the 21st.
Can I make an announcement about the International Day of Peace?
Sure.
It happens to be the same day, but the Afghan youth in Afghanistan are planning a big event that day, which is going to be live streamed all around the world. So it's for young people. There'll be music and dancing and a lot of short speeches by young people for young people. And I've got my card, which I will pass out as you leave. If you know any Afghan people, if you'll pass this on to them, because they want to get as many young people around the world involved in this as possible. And they're also trying to get other groups to also have an event in conjunction with their event that day. So we've agreed to have an event like that in Fort Worth at that big park, that big beautiful park, Trinity Park. And so anyone that wants to come is welcome to come, but especially it's in honor of the Afghan youth. So if you know any Afghan people, I'd really appreciate it if you tell them about it. And it's from 11:30 to 3:30, so they've got plenty of time to go get all this stuff for the banquet.
Yes, I appreciate that.
So it's a picnic, and it's a celebration of International Day of Peace, and we will be watching the event that's going on in Afghanistan. Although the time is different, but they'll be replaying it. This television station in Afghanistan is going to just keep replaying it for 24 hours so that everybody in the world can see it.
Is that, you're going to have it on Facebook? Is it on that?
Yeah, I put it on, but I did it wrong and I have to redo it because I got it on as a private event. Well, actually, at the time, I didn't know whether I should make it public because I'm afraid of tech wars. So, I'm still kind confused about that, but if you let me know you want me to notify you, I mean, my information is on this card, and I'll be sure to send you your own invitation. Anyone that is gonna be kind to Muslims and to Afghan people is welcome to come, but I'm just trying to avoid hecklers if I can.
And how young are the people? I have some Afghan friends who are refugees.
Afghan youth is considered anyone who was born during the Perpetual War. And the Perpetual War has been going on for at least 40 years.
Okay.
So anyone who's 40 is young enough to be young. And the older Afghan youth are going to be mentors to the younger Afghan youth.
Yeah.
Well, that's an issue of ageism.
Ageism, yes.
Ageism now. We have to talk about ageism.
Can we get a hand for John, Jenny, and Karen, all the good things they're doing?